Today we are having the second session on communication, and this session we are trying to include communicating bad news, pollution, and handling how to handle a angry patient. So these are common situations which we come across during our practice, and we don't know what to do in such situations. Uh, so I'm not taking much time, and probably Biju also have a bad news to break or to communicate. So Dr. Biju Raghavan, as I introduced you in the last class, is the head and consultant of palliative medicine department in Rajagiri Hospital, Alva, and he has done his diploma in pain and palliative medicine and has been working in palliative care for more than 15 years. So welcome Biju, and it's over to you.
Thank you, Sunil. Thank you, everybody else who has joined in for today's session. Um, as Sunil said, I just want to inform that I'm not doing that well. So I'll be here only for the class, and case part will be taken care of by Sunil. Um, so let us, without much ado, start the session for the day. Can we have the presentation? Can you please
Yes,
share
sir.
the presentation?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Will.
So last time we had talked about some general do's and don'ts and general principles related to communication skills. And today we will talk about uh, some of the procedures of communication. So one uh, elective procedure is communicating bad news. Another would be how to manage collusion. During last session, a lot of questions were related to these two topics, especially how to manage collusion. So let us start. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is what the three topics we will be covering today. Next slide, please. So when we are talking about communicating bad news, uh, you may have noticed I have not written breaking bad news because breaking itself is a violent act, and communicating bad news is a fairly gentle act. So I have done away with the usage breaking bad news. Instead of that, I always say communicating bad news. So there are by and large two models that we usually come across when it comes to breaking bad news or communicating bad news to the patient. I emphasize communicating bad news to the patient, not to the family. In some countries where the patient's autonomy is considered to be sacred, there you can talk to the family only with the permission of the patient. So in those countries, you have to disclose the bad news to the patient uh, fully, and hence we can call it a full disclosure model. That is, you tell the patient the bad news completely, and you can talk to the family only with the permission of the patient. The other model that we may be familiar in India, and which is the practice in most of the Oriental cultures, that is, we do not tell the patient at all. Even if the patient and the family comes to us together in our consultation room, we will ask the patient to go out of the room, and we discuss the bad news to the family with the family. So not disclosing this to the patient, we can call that a non-disclosure model. So these are the two prevalent models that we see being practiced depending on where you are practicing. Next slide. So now let us look at what are the patient's rights when it comes to access to information. One is what we can easily understand, that the patient has the right to know. It's also important to understand that the patient has the right not to know. Now, these rights comes into conflict with the models that we discussed. For example, if we are practicing a non-disclosure model, that is, we do not tell it to the patient, this right of the patient to know comes into conflict with that model. If we are practicing a full disclosure model, and suppose there is a patient who does not want to know, then that right comes into conflict with the model of full disclosure. So there are problems with both the models, because in both the models there's a potential of going into conflict with what the patient wants, and hence we have to figure out what we can do regarding this, how we can protect the patient's right to know as well as the patient's right not to know if the patient does not want to. Next slide. And so that is the question that we are going to deal with in today's session. Next slide. So for each individual, we have to make a model. For those who do not want to know, we do not tell. For those who want to know, we tell. So the question is how to figure out the person in front of you, whether the person wants to know or not. And it doesn't end there. If the person does not want to know, then you continue to provide all other support, uh, including psychosocial support, apart from the medical clinical support. Just because the person refuses to hear the bad news does not mean uh, the person can be denied the rest of the other care. Similarly, those who want to know, we have to figure out how much they want to know and only give information as much as they want to know, not more, not less. So this is the gist of the matter of how we are going to communicate bad news in an individualized disclosure model. So some of the questions that might come into our mind is, how do we differentiate between a person who wants to know and does not want to know? And if somebody does want to know, how would we find out how much the person want to know so that we dispense only that much of information, not more, not less? That's a skill that we can easily master. In this session, we'll have an idea of how we go about it. Next slide. Next slide, please. So before we go on to how, let's see who should communicate bad news. Many times, whenever I put up this question, uh, sometimes mostly people come up and say the doctor. Remember, doctor may not have the trust of the patient. So it is important for us to build up that relationship of trust. And during our previous session, we had some tips on how to go about. It's also acknowledged that doctors will probably have the most information about the medical condition of the patient. But our biggest handicap is that we most of the time are unable to communicate in a language that is easily understandable to the patient, because we learnt our medicine in Greek and Latin and we end up using Greek and Latin jargons when communicating medical information. So having information is not good enough. We have to get over handicap of not knowing how to speak in common man's language. Then, of course, the third part, the skill of communicating bad news. So we as medical professionals should strive to earn the trust of the patient, share information in a common man's language without the medical jargon, and use the skills of communicating bad news. There are many medical colleges where such skills are taught in a structured manner, and then there are many medical colleges where it is not taught. Next slide. So again, before going on to the how, let us find out why we should communicate bad news. If there is a, 65-year-old gentleman with multiple metastasis, why should the person know? Why should a 70-year-old know? Why should an 80-year-old know about their terminal illness? Many times we hear, let them be happy, let them not know about this. So there are some of the arguments that we hear against communicating bad news. And that is in the best interest of the patient, don't tell them. So we have to understand that there are very important reasons why communicating bad news is important. One is closure of life's business. There are many things in our life that we need to finish off before we die. It could be related to our money matters, it could be related to property, it could be related to bank accounts, it could be related to relationships, it could be related to having a friction with somebody and that you have nurtured for many years. Now is perhaps the time for asking forgiveness or giving forgiveness. There is a chance for empowering long lost friendship. Uh, People just drifted away. If one realizes that one's time is limited, maybe it's time to catch up. Maybe it's time to fulfill your bucket list as long as your body and mind permits you. So there are many, many things to be done before we go. And if one has an incurable progressive illness, so the earlier you'll know, the better it is, because after the initial shock and after the initial crime, when we come back to senses, then we realize there are things to uh, done, there are things to be done, there are things to finish. And that's the choice that we cannot deny to people. Similarly, hospital hopping and doctor shopping, when people don't know what is going on, they soon get disappointed with the best care that they're receiving at the hospital because their expectation and their reality are at two different levels. Their expectations is at sky high, their reality is at the ground level. And just because nobody told them what is their reality, their expectation will not match. So this mismatch creates dissatisfaction. However much however excellent care you may provide, it will not match up to their expectation. And it is not their fault. It is because they have not been told the truth, and as a result they will go from one place to another, from another place to yet another place. In meanwhile they will lose whatever money they had, they will go into deep debt, and as a result by the end the patient dies, the family is literally on the road, children lose out on education, there is no money, they lose their house. And this is a common reality in our society, especially in the poorer countries. A lot of poverty is caused by medical burden, and a good chunk of that medical burden happens because of futile per- perusal of medical care, where we know that the person cannot be helped, but still we know that a lot of patients with terminal illness in the last couple of months spend excessive amounts of money because they end up being in the ICU. Enormous amount of money is spent unnecessarily because there is no gain out of it, either in quality of life or quantity of life. Plenty of literature on this matter is available. Then because the bad news has not been communicated, the patient's family is forced to play a drama in front of the patient. So the relationship, there's a barrier. There is no honesty in this relationship. There is no time to hug and cry because the patient has not been told, or maybe the patient and one or two other family members have not been told, but rest of the family understands this. But you cannot be honest with your relationship. because the truth is not out there. And we in palliative care we talk about total care, where we talk about the biopsychosocial, spiritual, existential suffering and total care that we need to put in. So when we have a patient who has not been told about about their diagnosis or prognosis, how and the family is colluding, please do not tell the patient, then how are we ever going to provide total care when there is absolutely no chance for us to speak honestly with the patient? And hence, it is important to communicate bad news. Next line, next slide, please. So the spikes protocol is what is universally taught as the best way of communicating bad news. The spikes is acronym stands for setting up the interview, assessing the patient's perception or what is the patient's insight. Remember in previous session we talked about when we talked about history taking 2.0, we talked about finding out what the patient understands about his or her illness. So that understanding of, is that insight about what is happening to me. So that perception we need to assess, and then we should obtain the patient's invitation. Now this is where we differentiate between the patient who wants to know and patient who does not want to. And then there is the sharing of knowledge, sharing of information honestly. And then we should allow ventilation of emotion, because this knowledge can be traumatic. So it is a gentle way of introducing the knowledge, but still it is emotionally traumatic, and it is important to allow ventilation of emotion. And only then we talked about what are what are the things that we can do, what are the things that we can't do, and how and where we can proceed with it. So this is in short the spikes, and then now we will talk about this in detail. Next slide, please. So I always teach communicating bad news as a procedure, because like any intervention, there is an indication, there's a standard operating part, there are steps to it, and there is an expected outcome. So communicating bad news is a procedure. Next slide. So there's a pre-procedure preparation required. And what are those? Just like before you do a surgery or an intervention, you up to date yourself on the patient's medical information. You go through the medical charts, even if you're familiar with it, you still go through the medical chart to see whether you're missing out on anything. And then, just like any procedure, you allocate a time for it. You consider communicating bad news as an elective surgery, so you allocate a time for it. In my case, usually I keep the time in the evening, which is more convenient for me, because morning sessions I am busy, and by evening most of the other consultants, their OP would be winding down and it is much quieter. And I am also having little time on my hand. So if at all I have to do if I have to communicate bad news, I prefer to put it in the evening. And that's what I also talked about, setting up the environment. And the active listening skills are the things that we talked about in the previous sessions. That is reducing the barriers and doing the do and taking care of the do's and the don'ts. Next slide, please. So when we are talking about communicating bad news, we start off normally like any other interview. We take the patient's history, remember history 2.0, and get the patient's insight and concerns, and explore if the patient wants to know. So either the patients may ask you, what is wrong with me? Or you can ask, do you want to know what is going on? So if they say yes, then don't straight away start telling the bad news. The moment they say yes, or moment they themselves ask you what is going on, the important thing is to give a warning shot. Next slide. A good example of a warning shot is, if it is something serious, would you still want to know? Remember, it is in two parts. First, we are telling them that it may be serious. There is a probability of something serious. And the second part of the warning shot is, would you still want to know? So if I were, this part is very important because giving a warning shot changes the whole atmosphere from a casual interview to something serious. That was point number one. Point number two, it gives the chance to the patient who asked that they want to know, it gives them a chance to consider that do they really want to know. And as a result, those who are not mentally prepared to know, they may back out. And how do we know? They may not make eye contact. They may continue staring at the floor, or they may stare at any other place, but they will not look into your eyes. Or they may make an excuse. They'll say, "You give me some medicines, I'll come back after 2 weeks." Or they may straight away tell you, "No, I don't want to know. You tell it to my son, you tell it to my daughter," or etc. etc. So this is the defining moment, and this is the warning shot is what differentiate a person who wants to know from a person who does not want to know. And the person who wants to know, who really wants to know, after hearing the warning shot, will look into your eyes and say, "Yes, I want to know." So there is no confusion. Only proceed with a person who looks into your eyes and says yes after getting the warning shot. So that is the importance of warning shot. That is what differentiates between a person who wants to know and doesn't want to. So never skip the warning shot. It is very, very important. And uh, shall we go into the next slide? After a warning shot, I just talked about this. Serious business mode interview proceeds as a serious business, and patient gets a chance to reconsider the decision. And if the patient confirms the desire to know, then you tell the story of the patient like a story, and which is called a narrative approach. Next slide, please. You tell the story of the patient to the patient from the beginning. For example, if the patient had some cough and weight loss and had initially gone to the local doctor who gave him some medicines for 1 week and there was no relief, and then thereafter the doctor asked for a chest x-ray, and thereafter the chest x-ray, the patient was sent to the city hospital for scan and biopsy, etc. If that is the story, then you tell the story of the patient to the patient from the beginning. And while you are telling the patient his or her story, you fill in the blanks with information that the patient does not have. And how do you know where those blanks are? That is, initially, when you take a history, when you find out the patient's insight, then you know what are the things that the patient knows and what are the things that the patient does not know. So you know where the blanks are in the patient's history when you are taking history of the patient. So that is the importance of taking a more detailed history, which includes the patient's insight, because that will tell you what are the areas that the patient knows and what are the areas the patient does not know. For example, if the patient was told that the x-ray, after the x-ray, that he have to go to the city hospital, but the patient was not told what was there in the x-ray, so you can fill in that blank. For example, so that is, you're giving small chunks of information which fills in the blank as you go along the story. For example, the x-ray showed something like a shadow, something like a shadow, and that something like a shadow graduates into a shadow as the story proceeds. So when you went to the doctor asked for an X-ray. The X-ray showed something like a shadow, and to find out what the shadow was, he referred you to the city hospital. So something like a shadow becomes a shadow. They found something like a shadow, and to find out what this shadow was, they referred you to the city hospital. Next slide, please. And in the city hospital, they did a CT scan and they found something like a tumor. And to find out what this tumor was, they decided to do a biopsy because they were suspecting that probably it was something like a cancer. So it is this way that you gradually escalate the information. You escalate by giving small chunks of information which fills in the blank of the patient's insight. At any point of time, when patient gets new information, it is possible that the patient may break eye contact and it seems that the patient is thinking about it. At that point of time, you pause the story, do not proceed. Because pausing the story is because pausing the story uh, gives the patient time to grasp the meaning of the information the patient is getting. It is possible that after some time the patient may make eye contact with you and then you proceed with the story. Suppose you are in a situation where the patient is not making eye contact and you are confused, then you can ask, should I proceed? And at that point of time, the patient may give you permission to proceed by shaking the head, making eye contact, and or saying something like go on, etc. If even after asking the patient is not responding, not making eye contact, then you will have to consider that perhaps the patient had enough. Even though the story is not complete, but whatever information the patient has received may be enough for the patient for the time being. In that case, do not proceed because then you may be overdosing with information. Next slide. So once the patient has had enough or the story is finished, then be prepared for an emotional reaction or even a lack of emotional reaction to the bad. Sometimes the emotional reaction can be in the form of tears, sometimes it can be in the form of anger, sometimes it can be in the form of stunned silence. Sometimes the patient may say, I always suspected it, I knew it, etc. etc. But whatever be it, be prepared for an emotional reaction, and it is most important to allow the emotional reaction to flow. Because when somebody is in a high state of emotion, then it is impossible to have a sane conversation because when the emotions are high, then it is very difficult to have a sane conversation. So allow the emotion to subside. Next slide. Now this is the after the uh, warning shot. This is perhaps the second most important slide that I want you to consider. When patients are in that state of high emotion, don't say something, don't do something, just be there. Don't say something, don't do something, just be there. Now, this is something that has not been taught to us. We're always taught to do something or to say something. I'm saying, I'm asking you, requesting you, when the patient is in high state of emotion, don't say something, don't do something, just be there. That's perhaps the very difficult thing to do as far as we professionals are concerned, because that goes against our very grain of being professional. But that is the most important part. Next slide. Once the emotional reaction has subsided, then talk about what can be done, what cannot be done. The patient itself may ask many questions, answer them honestly, and it's possible that some of the questions that may come, you may not have an answer. For example, why did God do this to me? It's not possible to have an answer to questions like that. So it is important to uh, ask. Sometimes it is important to ask, why do you ask? Remember in our previous session, I talked about do not assume. So when somebody says like this, why, and this kind of question, then you ask, because when you ask, they will tell you why they are saying what they are saying. Sometimes the patient may say, I want to know how much time I have. And immediate reaction should not be the number of days as per the statistics available. You have to ask why they are asking. Ask why are they asking that. It's possible that it could be either an emotional reaction or they may have a very sane reason to asking that question. They may say, I have this my daughter's marriage coming up 6 months from now, something like that. If that is the reason, and they are asking. So we as human beings, we just cannot say how much time somebody is going to live. So many a times we talk about in our palliative care setting, we usually talk about if somebody is going down uh, every month, the person has got months to live. If somebody is going down on every week, perhaps the person has got weeks to live. Somebody is going down every day, perhaps we have got days to live. So, and that is more likely to be accurate than a statistical study number. And whatever be the questions that comes up, be honest about the answers you give, including the uh, answer that I don't know. But it should not stop at I don't know. It should also go on to I don't know, but I'll try to find out, or I'll direct you to somebody who probably will know. So it's just not enough to say I don't know. Honestly, it's also important to help them out by telling that we'll try to find out. Next slide. Most important do's and don'ts here: do not give false hope, always give achievable hope, and also give up a clear follow-up plan. And whatever the decisions you have come up with the patient or the family, it's important that you facilitate decision making. Just don't give my opinion and this is what I advise. Always say this is advisable option. There's another option like that. I suggest you talk to everybody in your family and discuss among yourselves and get back to me. And then we will decide what needs to be done. So always encourage participatory decision making. Decisions by consensus are always the most practical way of going about it, especially in serious health related suffering. Next slide. Ask for any clarification or doubt that the patient or the family may still have, and close the interview by leaving the door open that we talked about during the last session. Next, next slide. After the procedure, call upon the patient before the day is over. If the patient, uh, if the procedure was done on a OP basis, then call up the patient at their home, or if you are busy, you can arrange your team member, somebody to call up the patient just to inquire how they are doing and if they have any more questions. Or if the patient is inpatient, you can either personally visit before you go, or you can arrange somebody of your team to visit them uh, later. And every time you visit, it's possible that the patient and family may have many more questions because this is the biggest the biggest tragedy that may have befallen in the history of their family. So they may have many questions, and many of the questions will be repeated because of the emotional state of mind. So it is important to give the same answers, and also important to inquire why they are asking what they are asking. Next slide. Okay, can we go back? So can we go back? Go back one. Yeah. So this is where we are stopping with communicating bad news. If you have any questions on that, you may please send it on the chat. Sunil will help with that. So we'll talk about the questions at the later stage. And so we proceed to the next topic, which is collusion. Can we go on to that? So collusion is essentially a conspiracy of silence. In our culture, in the Oriental culture, it is usually the family member who comes to the medical professional, doctors and nurses, etc., and they come to us and says, please do not tell it to the family. And this is basically they are trying to conspire with us to keep the information away from the patient. That is, do not tell the patient. So collusion is a conspiracy of silence between two parties to keep the third party out of the information loop. Next slide. Why do people do this? Because the family is trying to protect their loved one, and protect their loved one from whom? From us. Next slide. And why are they trying to protect them from us? Because we have the terrible information that they are trying to protect the loved one from. So it is important that we acknowledge the family's fear. We have to, within ourselves, we need to understand that family is scared. They are trying to protect their loved one. They are anxious. They are fearful. So accept that within our hearts, we have to understand family is fearful. Next slide. It's also important to understand that people have beliefs, and however ridiculous it may seem to us from our point of view, from their point of view, it is real and it is important. So do not ridicule, do not challenge, do not make fun of people's belief because it will only increase their anxiety and maybe even bring in anger. Next slide. So the most important part of managing collusion is to agree to collude. When a family member comes in saying that I my loved one is waiting outside, we have not told him or her about the disease. Please do not tell him. In that case, you just say, okay, I will not tell him. This will immediately bring down their anxiety. They may not trust you yet, but at least their anxiety will come down. It's very important to bring down their anxiety because in our culture, the patient does not come to us. It is the family which brings the patient to us. So until and unless you have the family on our side, we just cannot do enough for the patient. So if you antagonize the family, they will take the patient away from you and whatever good you could have done for the patient, with collusion or without collusion, with sharing information or without sharing information, whatever you could have done for the patient, even that will be lost. So it's very important to have the family on your side. And to have the family on your side, you need to bring down their anxiety and earn their trust. As much as we strive to win the trust of the patient, it's here it is important to win the trust of the family. And the first step is to reduce their anxiety, and you do that by agreeing to collude. In my case, I asked them, so what have you told him? And they will say, oh, we told him it is just an ulcer. So I'll tell them, I asked the family. They said, okay, if I also say it's an ulcer. So this is a way of not only reducing anxiety, but also building up a relationship with the family so that they will start trusting. Next slide. So building a relationship, as I said, with the family is very important in our ultimate goal of managing collusion. Cater to the needs of the family and then listen to the family. Then you will realize that they have so and so beliefs. This is how their experiences. For example, I have come across plenty of family members who say that they know of somebody who had a radiation and immediately the patient died. So there's a belief that if you take radiation, you die. uh, doesn't matter what we believe, that is the belief of many in the community. So we have to work with it. There's If we work at loggerheads with it, they always have the option to take the patient away from us. Then we are not able to help the patient at all. It's important to work with the family, and for that, it is important to listen to them first and earn their trust, and then bring our point of view at a later date. Next slide. And once we have the trust of the family, then gradually we can orient the family towards the, the topics that we talked about: hospital hopping, doctor shopping, uh, a chance to finish their life's business, the barrier. This Remember, when we talk about these things, once the patient's family is willing to listen to us because they trust us, they'll realize that lot of things that we're talking about is a reality in their own lives. They are suffering because of those things. And once they realize that this is actually happening to them, then they will seek our help. You don't Mostly I have a family saying, I don't know what to do. You tell me, and you guide me. So that is when I tell them that sharing information honestly is perhaps what is required here. And then uh, most of the time my experience is that they ask me to convey it to the patient. So it is our skill lies in how to get the family into that position where they have no, where they realize that what they have been doing, that not telling the patient has had so much of negative uh, aspects to it, consequences to it, that they will ask me to please convey it to the patient. And once I reach that stage, then that is how the collusion has been broken. And even when the family request me to convey it to the patient, convey the truth to the patient, I always tell them that I will convey it only if the patient wants to know. I will not force information onto the patient. Next slide. So it's also possible that many a times we may not be able to convince the family about the importance of sharing uh, news honestly. That is communicating bad news. So have patience, try, uh, continue working with the family, but also be prepared for failure. Because if you try to push your agenda, it's possible that you will be pushed back. So, and this has a problem. It can create friction between you and the family, and the trust may be lost. So, it has to be a very gentle procedure. You do not force the ideas onto the family. You work with them. You do not force them to accept our point of view. Yes, it's a delicate skill to manage collusion, and the, initially the conversion rates may be low, but as your skills improve, gradually you will realize your conversion rate improves, and you will find that more and more families are willing. They become convinced about the need to communicate bad news, and it's still possible that we'll never have 100% conversion. Even the best of the skilled people will have failures. For that, I want to let you know that uh, trying and failing, there is no shame into it. The only shame is in not trying. So always try to manage collusion. Whether you are able to convert or not is different, but always try, and always discuss with other people how they are talking, and better still observe if possible. Mentorship, observe with you, if possible, take rounds with senior people in this field who are much more experienced in communication skills, and see how they are operating, not only for collusion in general, the body language and tone of voice, etc. All of these things creates the situation for either positive outcome or not so good outcome. So of course we have limitations in this session because it's online and it's a very limited time we have. But it's something that we need to continuously polish our skills, and we get better outcomes as we go along. But also be prepared for failures. And failing is never it's never shameful. Not trying is definitely shameful. Next slide. Okay. So can we go back? So those who have any questions on collusion may please put it in chats, and then we will proceed to the next and last topic for today, which is anger. Next slide, please. Anger is an emotion. It's a high energy consuming negative emotion, and hence in our clinical environment, we are often faced with anger because, as I said in my previous session last week, the challenge of medical communication skills is because we're starting with negative. When people go to a hotel or a resort, they are starting with positive, but people come to us when they are sick, when they are suffering, and that they are in pain. So the starting point itself is negative, and hence it is very common for people to get angry because they are suffering. And the source of the suffering could be multiple, uh, because they are sick or they have financial issues, or people in the hospital, they did not treat them well, they were rude, maybe the security person was rude, or the lift person was not caring enough. It could be anything. But many times we are faced with people who are angry in our clinical environment. And please remember, the cause of that anger is multiple, and essentially a manifestation of emotional stress. Next slide, please. So important aspect of anger management is to understand that we have to cut off the energy that fuels anger, the fuel supply. The fuel is in two forms. One is either confrontation, as in arguing or uh, putting a point across, or even giving an excuse. And sometimes when somebody is very very angry, even apologizing can increase the anger. So even that can be taken as confrontation. If more than one person, two, three, four people come together to try to explain, that also will be seen as confrontation by the person who's getting angry. Um, Also, another fuel of increasing anger is ignoring the person. You may be ignoring the person because you are busy, or you are afraid to confront that person. So if you are not making eye contact, etc., etc., all that can also increase anger. So you confront, it can increase anger. You ignore, it can increase anger. So the most important thing to do is facilitate the anger to flow away. The analogy that I usually prefer is of ascites. You have an abdomen full of ascites. You confront it, it doesn't help. For example, if you hit the abdomen full of ascites, that does not solve the problem. You ignore the abdomen with ascites, that also does not solve the problem. So, what is needed? You put in a needle and drain the fluid away through a line. You facilitate what is filled in the abdomen to flow away in a controlled manner. In a controlled manner. Similarly, we have to facilitate anger to flow away in a controlled manner. Remember, I told you no confrontation, no ignoring. So, how can we do that? Now, here is where the body language is very, very important. So, when somebody is angry because of adrenaline, they are usually standing up because you cannot be relaxed while angry. So, most of the time, you will see that somebody who is angry is either pacing around, walking around, or standing many times with the hand on the hip in an aggressive posture. So if you are the one, it may be the person may not be angry at you, but if you are the one who is available, you are the skilled person who is available to control this, to firefight this fire over there, then you have to adopt this method. You stand up, because when you stand up, you are equalizing your body position with the other body position. So equality of body position facilitates uh, good quality communication. If you are sitting, it will seem arrogant. So just stand up and then make eye contact. And then when you're standing, make sure that you are bent a little forward. That your spine is in slight kyphosis. So when you are standing with a little bent in your spine, you are showing that you are respectful to the person who is getting angry. And when you make eye contact, you are also showing that you are confident. So when you are respectfully standing, you are not confronting, and when you are making eye contact, it shows confidence and it conveys that you are not ignoring. So you're cutting off both the fuel supply and you don't say anything. You just stand there respectfully, make eye contact, and let the person get angry. And when whatever the person is saying, it is important that you just stay silent and nod your head in agreement. Nod your head. And this posture is the analogy of facilitating ascitic fluid. You don't say anything. So this itself will facilitate this high energy negative emotion. And within a few moments, this high energy will come down. The person will start calming down. And once the person starts calming down, that doesn't mean the person is not angry. That doesn't mean there may not be again a flare up. But once the major anger is calmed down, then you can speak to this person. And what can you say? I need to know more about this. Can we sit down and talk? It's only you offer somebody to sit down and talk about this only after the major part of the anger is down, when the person is little calm. Only then you offer the person a seat to sit and talk more about it. And when the person accepts it and sits down, then you facilitate the person to ventilate more and more of the emotion so that you are helping the person empty out the negative emotion. And it's possible that then, after all that is said, and once you understood what triggered or what all triggered the anger, because you just made the person talk, 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 and all of this has emptied whatever emotion he had, and you got a lot of information. It's possible that there was nothing that you could do about it. And then this, but the procedure is complete because you have calmed down the person. However, if you find that there was some problem from your side, that is not from you personally, or but from the institution side, from some from other uh, members of your organization, that there's somebody said something unkind or something, you can always arrange to rectify that matter, and you can always arrange some apology. Or if something happened, you can make amends for that. But if there's nothing, that person just got stressed out and frustrated and got angry, then just allowing that anger to ventilate down, ventilate that emotion, and let the anger come down and diffuse completely is all that matters. Now, this is a very simple procedure and it is a tried and tested procedure. However, this will not work when we are dealing with a crowd, because then we have a crowd psychology that we cannot handle. And that becomes a law and order problem. It is no longer just a clinical anger management problem. And we are not equipped to deal with law and order problem. Another example of law and order problem would be when we are dealing with one person or a group of people who are under the influence of alcohol or other substances. So again, we are not equipped to deal with an anger which dangerously escalates into violence. It is best left to people who know how to handle law and order problem. Next slide. Another important aspect is your personal anger. So it's very important that you, because our work is stressful, so it's very important that we take care of ourselves. We talked about some of the things that we need to do to take care of ourselves in the previous session. So apart from that, we in our clinical practice, it is important that we have a buddy system where you can choose a colleague of yours who's usually around in your work area, or any other person that you can choose, and the arrangement would be that that person will spot whether you are getting stressed in the form of if your voice, if the pitch of your voice is increasing, or if there is uncharacteristic sarcasm creeping into your uh, conversation, or if you are visibly becoming angry. So this buddy of yours should point it out to you anytime it happens and as frequently as it happens, because it gives you time to realize that you are getting angry and helps you get your emotions under control. And of course, you pay back the uh, this thing back to the your buddy by pointing out whenever he or she is having high stress, so that the person also realizes and calms down. So this way of looking out for each other, whether one is getting out of control much before it actually happens, helps us to control our emotions in high stress out work environment that we practice. Next slide. I think is that's the end of it. So if you have any questions regarding anger, please put it in the chat box. Sunil and I will try to sort it out. Thank you so much. I apologize for the low energy that I bring in today. As I said, I was not keeping it well. So I hope Sunil will take the brunt of the questions and the case discussion today. Thank you,
Thank you,
Sunil.
Bijay. And I see there are two questions. One is on advance directive. Since Supreme Court has given guidelines about advance directive, at what stage do you discuss it with patients? The first one. And how do patients and families react to end of life care planning?
Uh, okay. Would you like to take care of that advanced directive question, Sunil?
Okay. So advance directive is, is a living bill which is written well in advance when the person has the mental capacity. Uh, so that he can plan his or her care when something happens to that person. And this can be done at any time. I think it will be good if we can plan it now, not waiting for another month or year. You can do it now or whenever you want. That is when you are in good mental capacity. We don't know what happens to us after a month. So it is always better to plan for advanced directive as early as possible.
Thank you, Sunil. And the tragedy of palliative care physician is that by the time a patient is referred to us, it is usually in a very, very advanced stage. Most of the time, unfortunately, we are not even referred the patient in terminal stage. We are referred the patient in dying stage. This precious little palliative medical care even is not possible. So it is important that all consultants who are dealing with clinical care uh, know about advanced care planning and talk to their patients who have uh, you know um, liver failure, kidney failure, cardiac failure, COPDs, interstitial lung diseases, uh, metastatic malignancies, uh, motor neuron diseases, dementias, Parkinson's, you name it. There are so many diseases where it is important as a specialist consultant of the disease concerned to talk to the patient and family, enlighten them about advanced therapies. The problem is this kind of communication does not happen very often at all, actually. And by the time, and there's also a problem that many doctors are not very well educated and aware about the concept of advanced care planning, the concept of end of life care. Most of the time people think that palliative care is for people who are dying, which is not true. I mean, we are here to enhance the living experience, and we are taking care of patients post-op pain management, post-trauma, respiratory supportive care, which includes refractory breathlessness due to cardiac as well as respiratory diseases, oncology supportive care. uh, there are so many aspects to palliative care that is not known to other specialists. So yes, advanced care planning, I agree with whatever Sunil has said, should happen at the earliest possible. What was the other thing about end of life care that came up with the question?
How do patients and their families react to end of life care planning usually? How do they face it when we talk to them about such things?
Yes, yes. See, the whole even this question comes from the background that end of life care is seen as something which is very scary. And by the time we have talked to the patient and family, it does not become scary at all. In fact, what I usually tell people is that even if your disease cannot be treated, I'll make sure that you do not suffer. I'll make sure that you are not in pain. I'll make sure you are not breathless. I'll make sure that you remain comfortable for as long as you need to be. So there's a lot of positivity which goes into providing end of life care. It is just a question of how you put it. And when I talk to the patients and the family that even if your disease cannot be cured, so that's the reason that they have been sent to me. And when I tell them that even if a disease cannot be cured, I'll make sure that you will not suffer. Most of the time, the response I get is, Doctor, that is all that we wanted to hear. And I'm glad we came to you. And it is not just that one statement. I'm just telling you that the response to that statement like that. Of course, there's a lot of other things that goes along with it. So the response once I am able to have a proper counseling session about end of life care, the response is usually very positive. And I never give false hopes. I always give realistic hope that I can provide irrespective of the stage of the patient's health. If I promise I'll take care of your pain, That's a promise I know how to keep, because that is what the training in palliative medicine has given me the confidence to give that hope, that realistic hope.
So, Viju, can the doctors show emotions during the interview with the patient and family?
If the doctor is not a robot and is a human being, then like any human being, the doctor will also have emotion, and nothing wrong with having emotions while having interaction with your patient and the family. In fact, it will make you more humane, and you will have more, you will have a greater and a stronger relationship with your patient and family, because they will trust you more. Now, this is the great what do you call lie, or what we have been taught, either overtly or covertly, subtly, that you should not have emotion with your patient and family. It's just a lie. This is practicing medicine is essentially about relationship between two human beings. That is, you, the medical professional, and the patient or their family. It is practice of medicine is about managing relationships, and true honest emotion. If you fake emotion, it is not going to help you. If you have normal emotions, honest relations, honest emotions when you're dealing with your patient and family, and not hiding emotions, all of that will strengthen the relationship between the patient and family, and it will work to your advantage. They will trust you more, they will listen to you more, the compliance will be better, and your outcome will be better.
Anybody has any more questions?
Sir, I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Um, Excellent presentation. I've learned a lot. My
Thank you.
question is, how early into the course or plan should you offer palliative care services? Is there any clue that it is that we can is there a clue or like an alarm that will tell us that it's time to offer palliative care services, or while we are doing spikes, can we already say this as present this as one of the options already?
Thank you for your question. Um, as far as when should palliative care start, I mentioned earlier, palliative care is not something you give only for somebody who is terminally ill. It's also for people who are undergoing active treatment, and not just for cancer, for any kind of diseases. And it is important to realize that it is important to start palliative care from the time of diagnosis, because when the diagnosis is made, usually it is accompanied by a symptom that needs palliation. And once a diagnosis is made, that knowing the what is going on can be emotionally traumatic. There also palliative care is needed. Having a serious illness will have social, financial, and existential dimensions to it. There also palliative care is needed. So whenever we are dealing with a serious health related suffering, irrespective of whether it's a cancer or a cardiac illness or a neurological illness, palliative care should start from the time of diagnosis. Now, a lot of cancer societies have uh, come to a conclusion, and in many countries, the palliative physician is part and parcel of the oncology team. So, right from the time of diagnosis, the patients are being seen by the palliative care physician. So, that would be the simple answer right from the beginning. Whenever there is suffering, palliative care should start. regarding the second question, Sunil, I did not understand that second part. Whether spikes protocol should be. What was the second part? If
I was just asking if, for example, during the spikes protocol, you performed already the spikes, and then the patient asked if what options does she have. Can you
yes,
already offer the palliative care as an option?
right. Yes, absolutely. Because see, I probably am repeating myself. Whether you whether you communicate bad news or not, there is palliative care should anyway be offered, because palliative care is not something that you offer only after you communicate bad news. It's about providing physical comfort. It's about providing emotional comfort. It's also providing social, financial, and spiritual and existential comfort. It's not a one person job. It's a multidisciplinary teamwork, and different people, depending on what area of suffering is that we have to deal with, comes forward, and there's a situational leadership within the multidisciplinary team. So whether we communicate bad news with the spikes protocol or not, palliative care definitely can be offered. I don't know whether that was what you were asking.
Yes, sir, definitely. Thank you so
Okay,
much. I
most
got
welcome.
my answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Sunil, is there any more questions?
Yeah, Dr. Nina.
Good evening, sir. Excellent presentation, sir. It
Thank
was
you.
wonderful.
Thank you.
My question was that having the perception of the patient, that point I feel it's very kind of difficult. I mean, understanding the perception of the patient. So
Okay, understood.
practically, how to get into that, sir?
Okay, for
Thank you.
example, if that was the patient who was sitting in front of me, I'll just give you a small example of history taking. So
Yes,
I'm
sir. Yes.
asking this person, so okay, what brings you here? Tell me from the very beginning. And the person says, around 2 months back, I had fever. Uh, so, sorry, I had cough and weight loss, and I went to the local doctor, and he gave me this medicines to take for 1 week. I took them, and I did not get any better. So I will intervene there and says, what was the medicines for? So he says he said that this is antibiotics and multivitamins. So he understands what this medicines was for. So that is his insight. And then what happened? So I went back to him after 1 week, and then he asked me to get an X-ray. And after that X-ray, he gave me a letter to go to the city hospital. So I'll intervene there. So I'll ask him, why did he take your X-ray? Probably the patient will say, I don't know. He asked me to get an X-ray, so I got an X-ray done. Okay, so his insight is, I don't know why the doctor asked me to get an X-ray. Then I'll ask him, so what was there in the X-ray? So probably the patient says, I don't know. The patient says, I don't know. The doctor looked at the X-ray, and then he gave me a letter to go to the city hospital. So the insight is, I don't know what is there in the X-ray. So that
Okay.
is how you find out the blank spot. So basically, you don't take any answer at face value. You ask why. Why?
Okay.
Why did he ask for a X-ray? What was there in the X-ray? What did they tell you? When you went to city hospital, why did they ask you to get a scan done? What was the result of the scan? What did they tell you? And why did they ask you to take this biopsy? What was the result of the biopsy? You keep digging for answers, you'll realize there are a lot of blank spots in the
Okay,
patient's
sir.
understanding.
Yes, sir. Yes.
So,
Okay.
so that is how we find out the
Yes,
blank
yes. That
spots.
made it easy, sir. It has made it very easy. Thank you, sir.
Yeah,
Thank you.
most welcome.
Thank you.
Are we done with the session?
Biju?
Hello.
Yeah, Biju.
So is it okay if I can be excused that
Yeah,
not
yes, Biju. You can leave now. Thank you.
thank you, Sunil, and thank you everybody for joining in. It was a great
Thanks,
session.
sir.
I wish I could have stayed back. I'm not feeling that well. I would like to take some rest. Okay, then bye bye, and everybody have a you know. Uh, I wish you well with the course you are doing. Wish you all well in your life. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So today's patient story will be presented by Dr. Anil. Arun, you can share the screen.
Okay, sir. Anil sir? Anil sir? Sir, please, sir. Sir, please unmute and start speaking, sir. Anil sir?
Yeah.
Okay, sir.
Good
Okay,
afternoon,
sir.
everybody. Can you hear me, please?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
sir.
yes.
First of all, I'd like to correct the breaking bad news should be, communicating bad news. The first slide, we need to correct that because in this lecture we learned, okay, don't need to speak. Breaking is little an angry word or a arrogant word. Anyway, so I'll start with the case. Yeah, he's a 40-year-old man who was brought to the hospital. He was very obese and he was brought in a very collapsed condition. And by the time he reached our casualty, there was no pulse, no blood pressure, no this thing. But the people who brought said he had seizure before 5 minutes, and we were brought immediately. So we checked the pupils. Pupils were semi-dilated and very poorly reacting. So we took him to the ICU and started all the actions. Next slide, please. Next slide. This gentleman, half an hour back, had the first seizure while driving from home to office, which is a very short distance. He was driving the car, and as soon as he came out of his compound, he banged into the other car and the standing car and the wall. And within a minute or two, he became again conscious after the seizure. And then he took the car back, went to the office. When he reached the office, he first did the regular morning prayers, putting a diya into the temple, and then he ordered for a coffee. Before the coffee could come, he again got the second seizure, and followed by the unconsciousness. The office staff who just brought the coffee, they realized this guy has just collapsed. So they picked him up and they brought him to our hospital, which is about 5 buildings away. It must have taken about 3-4 minutes or 5 minutes. Next slide. Next slide, please. As he was brought in a very collapsed condition with no blood pressure, no pulse, no spontaneous breathing, pupils were semi-dilated and not responsive to light. So all the protocols of the ICU was to start the immediate resuscitation. The CPR started. Next slide, please. The cardioscope which was connected showed a flat line, and they immediately started the external cardiac massage, IV adrenaline, IV atropine, sotavicarb, and he was intubated and connected to the ventilator. And there was some hope after the shock. It showed the transient response, and the ventricular fibrillation, we thought it's converting into the normal rhythm. But hardly in about 15 seconds, again, he went into VFib. And such thing continued, and the whole process of resuscitation continued for about 30 to 40 minutes. And it was, in spite of all the efforts, the patient could not be revived. There was a team of almost 5 or 6 doctors. There were 2 physicians and the intensivist and everyone. but unfortunately we could not salvage him. Next slide, please. During the time of CPR, about 10 or 15 minutes after this thing, I came out and wanted to interact with the mother and the family members. The mother had been diagnosed a few months back with CA breast with MATS. She was about 68 or 70, and other family members were also there. So I just wanted to give them some hint that the outcome may not be very good. So I just prepared mentally that he's in a very, very serious condition and we are trying our best. The whole team is working on him and we will let you know in some time how is the response. Next slide. In spite of all the restrictive measures, patient could not be revived and the patient succumbed. Now there was a challenge for me in different capacity to disclose because this family has been known to my family for almost more than 50 years. And we have been very closely associated. And this boy was also born in our hospital, Suchak Hospital, 40 years back. So I had to reveal all the facts to them. Next slide, please. First, I decided to speak to the uncle of that boy and the brothers, the deceased's brothers. I took them on the side. I gradually told them that he had a cardiac arrest and we did whatever best. He had shown some hope for some time, for a couple of minutes, but unfortunately he did not make it. And because I said, let me prepare the uncle and the brother first, so that gradually, if I have to go to the mother, these people have to first settle down, take the grief counseling had to be completed, and then then go and talk to the mother later on. Next slide. The first was the brother of the patient they were in denial because he was hale and hearty, every day working almost 12 to 14 hours, had no problem, used to go to the gym, and suddenly they were not prepared to believe what happened, how he collapsed and died. So they were in denial. I had to be very patient with them. I had to sit down with them and told them, okay, whenever somebody gets a very massive heart fibrillation and person goes into a cardiac arrest, all the patients cannot be revived. So then the second emotion was the anger. Okay, why me? Why us? See, he's such a young boy and everything, and he was already steady with a girl and he was to marry that girl. So for them, it was a very big shock. How, so all this thing took very, very long, almost half an hour to 40 minutes. I was interacting with them, patiently hearing them. And I was trying to also find out because I had no time to find about the history. So I asked them whether he was hypertensive, he was diabetic, was he on some medicine with somebody else? But there was no history about any illness or any medicines he was taking. So it took very long and still they were absolutely crying. The uncle was in tears. And, I gave them enough time, sat down with them and solace them. And I said, okay, now the most difficult part would be to talk to the mother. I will need you guys' support because she's already into some illness, and to accept a son's death is very, very difficult. Very, very difficult. It's very hard on somebody if a child of a parent dies. Next slide, please. So then I went to the mother. Mother got some hint. She started, okay, something is not right. And then she started crying loudly. I hold her hand. I was sitting with her for quite some time. I said, I am very, very sorry we could not salvage him. I didn't want to blame anybody, you brought him late or something like that. but the destiny was there and we could not save him. It's a very, very sad thing. And it took very long for the mother also. She was crying loudly, and she says she was also had all same anger. Why us? What have we done? Why my child has died? I am suffering from this disease. Let God take me instead of my child. You please go and try again. There must be something. But I said, okay, the whole team is there and we've not been able to help you. I'm very, very sorry. And the last ECG has shown a straight line. Both the pupils are dilated and he's already brain dead. We will not be able to help the patient. So when such a thing happens, it becomes very, very difficult to communicate such a bad news to the family. And you have to have enough patience. You may have whatever knowledge, information about the patient, but you have to have that wisdom of understanding and sitting with the patient, sitting with the family member, trying to make them, because this was the patient did not suffer from any disease in the past, so it was a very sudden death, and to accept a sudden death, it's very, very difficult, very, very difficult. If a person is suffering from a disease, mentally people start preparing themselves, but there was no time for preparation also. It was a very, very short period, and I said to the family, see, the cardiac arrest treatment was only 30-40 minutes, but I had to sit with the family for an hour and a half, till everyone gradually settled down. Then I gave them water, I asked for some tea, everything. My house is very close by. I took them to my house. We sat there, and then we said, okay, what next? Then once they started accepting the thing, then we said, okay, how next? So one brother was in USA. Then they spoke to him. They informed him what happened. Then he also spoke to me in details because he's in America, an engineer. So made him understand what suddenly was, he was an elder brother to this. He was about 3 years elder to this gentleman of 40. So this is the way because see, when I did my MBBS from 73 to 77, we did not have anything in our course, how to communicate or give news, because we learned during our practice, learned from some senior doctors or the honoraries who were teaching. But that's on the working way we started learning like that. But now listening to Dr. Biju's lecture, it was very fantastic. The way, so systematically he taught us how to deal. So I think even I am learning after almost 40 years of practice, okay, how to become better in communication. So this is one incident where there's a Jack and Mac are walking for praying in church. Jack wonders whether it would be all right to smoke while praying. Mac replies, why don't you ask the priest? So Jack goes up to the priest and asks, Father, may I smoke while I pray? The priest replies, no, my son, you may not. This utter disrespect to our Jack goes back to, disrespect to our God cannot be accepted. Then Jack goes back to his friend and tells him that priest did not like it. So Max says, I am not surprised. You asked the wrong question. Let me try. So Max goes up to the priest and asks, Father, may I pray while I'm smoking? To which priest eagerly replies, by all means, my son, by all means. So how you put it, the message to the other person, it will all depend how a person would accept, the opposite person would accept. So this is a very small incident. May not sound this thing. Next slide, please. Next slide. I'll need suggestions if anybody has suggestions, okay, how one should deal. So this is what I dealt. It took time. It got accepted, but it was not easy for me also. But it was a shock to me also because this child was born here. I knew him, he grew up in my presence. So anybody could give their suggestions and experiences if they want to add something where I could communicate better.
Thank you, sir. So I would like to get opinion from any of you, your experiences.
I would have been happy Dr. Biju would have been there, our
Yeah.
teacher. Anyway, he was not well.
I'm sure all of you have communicated news of death to somebody. So, if you were in his position, would you have done anything else, or would you
Differently
do
or
it in
better.
different way? Nobody? Okay. So, uh, I think what you have done is correct. And what if I were in your position, what I will do is almost the same. So when the person was brought to the ICU, he had no pulse and
No blood pressure.
BP. He has semi-dilated pupil. So I will, as there are other doctors in the ICU,
Yeah.
and if they can manage the patient, I will come out of the ICU and immediately will ask the available family members to have a meeting with
Yeah.
me, and I will ask them, do you know what has happened? So they may be telling something. Sometime they would know that, okay, when he was brought, he was unconscious. That's what they know. They don't know he didn't have pulse or semi-dilated pupil, etc. So they may tell, okay, he was unconscious. Okay, then I will go and tell them that okay, because this is something which we have to communicate to the family, because the person is probably he may die. So I will tell them, okay, you are right, he was unconscious, and there is something else to that. So they may ask, what is it? So I will tell them, okay, it is not simply unconsciousness alone. It is something serious. So that, and I will stop there. Then this is what Biju was telling, giving information in small chunks, which the people can understand. And then they may ask, what is seriousness, or if they don't talk anything and looking at me, that I will take as an indication to hear more about that. Then I will tell them, okay, he had no pulse, and he had no blood pressure. So he's almost in a um, or he's in the uh, process of going to uh, die. So uh, I will tell like that, and there will be some response from the family, and then I will tell them, okay, the doctors inside the ICU are trying to do cardiopulmonary resuscitation, which means you have to explain what is it,
Yes,
cardiopulmonary resuscitation, because they don't know
I
what
did.
cardiopulmonary resuscitation. And uh, I don't know how much it is going to be successful. Uh, I don't know actually the statistics of success rate in CPR. If any of you know, that can be told. But tell them that we are doing it in good intent, that he should overcome this. But please be understand that it is not always successful. So this is what I will tell at the first instance,
Mm.
and will sit with them for some time if they want to ask anything to me.
Yeah.
And after that, I will also go into the ICU and will be with the patient, and then will give regular updates. Uh, and
I came out only once after about 15 minutes, but I should have come frequently, say 2, 3 times, say about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, something like that, till the process was going on. Initially, though, when the team was working, we had to, put all the machines immediately in about 2, 3 minutes, secure the IV line, and start giving drugs, put the emergency trolley, and so
yeah,
many
that's more important at that
that
during
time.
that
Yeah.
time. Yeah,
After once that started, then I came out. Sort of
yeah.
once.
So Dr.
And
Gopal Nayan,
they had confidence in me, says, why don't you go and you should work because we have trust in you.
yeah.
Your team is there, but you go inside, try your best. So,
Sir, I have a question. It is hypothetical question.
Ji,
Yes.
So, as usual, when the patient is coming to the ICU without pulse, without BP, and pupils dilated, we start CPR, correct?
yeah,
And what if we manage to revive the heart and he's already brain dead? Then what happens? What is the next
happens.
step from there?
Yeah, we keep the patient on ventilator,
Exactly, sir.
and if the blood pressure comes up, then
Yeah.
we would wait for the after 4 hours or 8 hours, we'll call a neurologist to check whether he
Yeah.
is really brain dead. Either do a EEG or the test
Yeah. Yeah.
done for
Yeah.
brain dead. And if
Yeah.
that comes positive, then
Yeah.
try to first give grief counseling to the family, and then gradually approach them for organ donation. I would think of, because one patient we had earlier, about few years back, where the patient went into cardiac arrest, and then we revived the patient, but it took little few minutes. So he was, hypoxic brain damage had occurred. And
Exactly,
he had
sir.
to
That is
realize he was to
yeah,
end
exactly,
of
sir.
spot.
That is my question
And
because when the patient
all the organs were utilized.
Yeah.
5 organs were utilized. at the time.
Yeah, but the thing is, once the patient is revived, then we have to put all the invasive lines, the
Absolutely.
CV line,
Yeah.
the art line, and
Art
then
line.
you have to revive the patient. And then
Yeah.
the question of how long can we keep him on the ventilator? We have to keep him till the family agrees for the
Absolutely.
solution, right?
Yeah, true. Absolutely.
Yeah. So that, I mean, this was the hurdle that we were facing at one point because families usually they don't give in. They will come and ask you, sir, can you try till the last C and happen because obviously it is their loved one. So
Absolutely.
so the decision becomes very tough.
Even the
So
brain acceptance of brain death takes time. It's not easy.
exactly,
At least
exactly,
twice.
and
Yeah.
yeah, by two different
Right.
neurologists over a period of 1 week
Period
or
of
something
time.
is the protocol.
4 hours.
For
That's
yeah,
what-
exactly, sir, exactly. Okay, fine. That's what I wanted to ask you. Thank
Right.
you, sir. Thank you.
I'll just mention I had a liver transplant 14 years back. I had 2 hepatomas. I had hepatitis C cirrhosis, which converted into hepatomas, and I went into advanced liver failure. They did a live donor liver transplant 14 years back, and after that, I started counseling patients and advising for liver transplant. Later on, I started giving lectures on organ donation. I must have given about 400-500 lectures at different forums. All the uh, about 93 branches of Indian Medical Association in Maharashtra. And wherever I get an opportunity, I talk about organ donation. So I promote organ donation all the time. wherever I get a chance.
Okay, that's great, sir. We will also think of calling you. Anybody else? Uh, I don't see any response from anybody.
All right. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So I think we can wind up the session. It's time now. In communicating bad news, we have to go step by step, but it will vary depending on the situation.
Situation.
Sometimes, actually, these steps are just guiding steps, and we can actually modify the steps of this spike protocol. So depending on the situation, you have to modify it. Thank you, Anil sir,
Thank you, sir.
for a good patient story, because